It's Alexander-Stewart from Inside the Ropes back again with another fantastic interview for you all. My guest today has wrestled across the globe from my hometown of Edinburgh to Japan to Ireland to Canada, the lot. He's wrestled in tag teams with Kevin Steen. He's taken on a range of opponents from household names such as Kenny Omega to a range of champions across WWE, AEW, Impact Wrestling, and more. It's the incomparable, the incredible Speedball Mike Bailey. Mike, how are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. So I love that intro. It's hilarious. So because of the pandemic and not being able to wrestle, leave my house, I've been doing a lot of Twitch streaming, and I know I'm going way too early into plugs. I'm sorry if that's a faux pas on your thing, but very often when I'm on Twitch, people will come in and ask like, oh, you're a wrestler. And they just kind of find the channel. Oh, you're a wrestler. So who did you wrestle and where did you wrestle? And then I go, well, if you know on TV, the champions of the major promotions is Kenny Omega, there's Bobby Lashley. I've wrestled them both. And then the former champion was Drew Galloway, wrestled him as well. And then I just have to name literally everyone they might know from TV and say that I have wrestled them. And it's kind of, it's fun, you know, it's a nice little validation thing. But also, here I am and there they are. So there we go.
Wrestling is still in one of those sort of strange phases where people will know wrestling and people might be a fan of wrestling, but there's so many different sort of subsections. Even if you take sort of the casual lapsed fan, you know, maybe they know Triple H, maybe, you know, they're in Japan, they know Tanahashi, but it's always strange, just, you know, even out in sort of normal job time when, you know, someone goes, oh, you do stuff in wrestling, and they're like, oh, I like wrestling, and I go, right, where are we going here? Do you like wrestling?
Yes.
Or are you familiar with who Hulk Hogan is? Because we're going to have very different discussions depending on how this is.
Very.
And most of the time I get, so is Triple H and John Cena still the champions? And I'm like, I'm just going to say yes and move on. Because otherwise we're going to have to sit and, you know, you've got AEW, which is bringing in a whole new crowd of fans, and it's, you know, it's great, but it always makes for a very interesting conversation.
But also, so there's a big conversation to be had about about fandom in general, and like, especially when it pertains to wrestling. I'm going to go on like two major tangents here before the proper interview that I'm sure you planned carefully has even begun. But number one is like, I don't like the word fans. I don't like the implications of that. I don't like fanatical. I don't think applies to most people that enjoy wrestling. I always make sure I do a lot of teaching wrestling, you know, to always refer to the audience as the audience, you know, and then people that directly like encourage me or like that have been following my career, like I prefer the word supporters to like fan, because it like is sort of a creepy power dynamic that goes along with fans.
We haven't gotten that Speedball Mike Bailey universe yet. We're not calling it the Mike Bailey universe yet. No.
Correct. And then there's a whole like discussion about like the people that are like, oh yeah, I love wrestling. I know John Cena and I know Hulk Hogan. Not to be like, this fucking guy doesn't know anything. Get away. I bet you don't even know who the Young Bucks won the New Japan Tag Team titles from on their first run, don't you? And like be dismissive. But no, you don't. Like, you want people to enjoy wrestling. If you enjoy wrestling and you want to support it, then like it's popular on Twitter as a thing to say, but like gatekeeping, which is overall a bad thing. And just be normal and let people enjoy things. And it feels like the natural thing to, if you enjoy something, then you'd want to share it with your friends. But somehow that doesn't always happen for professional wrestling. And again, I don't want to say professional wrestling because it's the same for everything else.
It's an interesting one, because especially sort of doing these interviews, a lot of times I'll sit down and I'll talk to guests, and, you know, it'll be a lot of fun. And then I put out and someone goes, oh, but you didn't ask them about this match in Dragon Gate and 2002, and I'm like, I didn't know that match happened. I do my research, but, you know, if you think I'm going to sit down before every interview and watch every wrestler's massive back catalogue, I mean, we're talking, you know, yourself, other wrestlers who have traveled the world. You've got thousands of matches, hundreds of matches.
There's a lot of wrestling that is happening and that has happened. My living is off professional wrestling, off of like understanding it and watching it and analyzing it and breaking it down. And I do as much of that as possible. but I still miss so much of it.
Oh, there's so much. Obviously, with Inside the Ropes, we try and cover everything, and so we have people who sort of will live tweet along with the major shows. But even then, you know, obviously being UK based as well, and the time zones, we're sat there and right, we've got this New Japan Strong show, this New Japan show, AEW, they've got the 4 shows, and it's like, you know what, I'm tapping out too much. I need to take a breather. But we mentioned the pandemic,
Yes.
obviously the unavoidable conversation of the pandemic in wrestling. I think fans haven't seen you wrestle since September last year.
Right.
Obviously, things are opening back up. We've seen you sort of do stuff for training. How have you adapted to the pandemic and trying to keep in ring shape and keep that sort of mental training of wrestling without being able to go out there and do it itself?
I mean, I haven't stopped training for 1 second, like in whatever form I could, like since I haven't taken like a week off from training ever since I was like, I don't know, 12 years old, and I started going to Taekwondo every day, in whatever capacity that was possible. Like, I'm aware that wrestling is different, right? In terms of cardio and in terms of ring shape and all that. And there's very much a thing to like staying on top of wrestling and the mental side of it, on top of just the physical side of it. And when I say mental, I mean like writing and planning the matches and remembering your stuff and going through matches. And I think when people come back from the pandemic, that's going to be the hardest part, is like remembering, man, what do I do during a match? What do I even do? How do I even put it together? And that's going to be the hardest part. But like staying in shape has not been difficult. I've had to adapt my workouts and make them different. When I didn't have a gym, it just became a lot more push-ups, squats, and chin-ups, and no more weights. And you know, it's annoying. It's less fun. I go to a gym because I prefer going to a gym. I've had to do it at home, but you got to do it with what you got. I have a Boss Rutan. What does he even call it? Like striking system, or it's a weird kind of weird dummy that you set up that I have, and I've been using that for kickboxing as well as like gymnastics and movement and everything. I have grass, so I use that when it's not winter. When it's winter,
especially in Canada.
Yeah, I've also had access to a wrestling ring for a long time, which is good. I mean, it's no training partners makes things a lot less productive.
Yeah.
But I've had access to wrestling, so I'm fairly confident I'm better now than I was before the pandemic, which is a good thing, because my biggest accomplishment in life is every single year I've been alive has been better than the last, and that is included in pro wrestling as well. I have never, I don't think I've had a match that showed like a decline in progress in my wrestling, and I think I've continued to get better.
I think for fans who've seen you obviously before pandemic happened, you know, I had the pleasure of watching you in Brighton for Riptide. You know, you've wrestled all over, and I think the idea that when you come back you're going to be even better is, I think that's dangerous for a lot of the other performers out there, because we all know how good you were, and if you're that next level, that's going to be sort of insane. We've mentioned before you've wrestled everywhere. You're one of the sort of season styles of independent wrestlers who's moved about. You know, you never really fixed yourself to one place. We've seen you Japan, Ireland, Germany, the UK, Canada, all over. What are the main sort of differences you've noticed in the style of wrestling between, say, Germany for WXW and Japan for DDT and things of the sort? What things stay the same, and what things do you have to sort of consciously think about and switch between depending on where you're wrestling?
Here is Liam, a true interview professional, sending me on one of my favorite rants, favorite things to talk about, which is like the cultural differences between like professional wrestling, and it's different everywhere. Audiences all over the world exist within a spectrum between Mexico and Japan, right? And going everywhere. So in Mexico, when most wrestling happens, of course, there's always exceptions and different little pockets of different styles. But culturally, when wrestling happens in Mexico, it's, hey, lucha is in town. Let's go. Let's watch. Let's get drunk and let's, enjoy the show, because it's like you don't have to be a fan of Lucha Libre to go and enjoy a show. It's like they're in town. Let's go. Let's have a party. And so that's very much reflected in wrestling. If you watch Lucha Libre, they do amazing stunts, amazing performers, incredible athleticism, really, really mind-blowing stuff. Like the most impressive wrestling, if you're looking for athletic ability, happens in Mexico easily. However, like logic and match structure and details and is not as present because it's not as important, right? Whereas if you go in Japan, there's a very, very like rich and long-lasting culture around pro wrestling, and like fandom in Japan is very like it's fandom. They are, a lot of them are fanatics. It's a lot more common. Like when I wrestled for DDT in Japan, which I did for like 4 or so years before the pandemic, the same 50 people, I want to say, came to every single DDT show. And they pay attention. They are quiet. They're listening. They're trying to catch on little details. And just because that's how like sort of the culture is, and storytelling in Japan, even outside of wrestling, is very like detail oriented and catching all the little subtleties and all that. And so it's important when you wrestle in Japan, you must pay attention to this, and logic and structure become a lot more important than, doing big stunts, which are, always fun and always important, but not as important. So of course that affects how the wrestling is, like how the wrestling happens. It's a lot more detail oriented because you have to please the audience. And then you have like America and England and Germany, and that all like situates somewhere in the middle of that. And you sort of have to be able to read your audience. It's a completely different thing. You have to organize your matches in a completely different way if you're going to wrestle in front of an audience that knows wrestling, that has expectations, and then you're going to have the chance to play around with those expectations in order to surprise them, versus a brand new audience that doesn't have any expectations. And part of your match is maybe a bit more to create the expectations so that people higher up in the card or later in the match, you'll be able to play off with those expectations. But it's a very complex machine. It's my favorite part of wrestling. Playing with audiences and matchmaking and understanding that part. I always want to say that if you wanted to push pro wrestling to more mainstream audiences and not just wrestling fans, I would show them the event of having two people who do not speak the same language, have never met, go in a room together for 30 minutes approximately, do a bunch of like weird gesticulations at one another, and then turn that into a live action, one take, flawless fight choreography that happens in front of an audience that goes nuts for it. And I think showing that whole process would be a lot more interesting than showing just the end result.
I think it would be the perfect blend of almost like it's got the ingredients of like a reality show where you're seeing that background, but like you say, it's the spectrum of wrestling and the way you put it, Mexico to Japan, I find really interesting, because me and my friends have always had sort of discussions about this, because we kind of inhabit different elements of it. Sort of my background in wrestling is through Lucha Libre, through my parents. We've got friends who, pretty solely watch like the UK stuff and all over. The one we had always discussed is, we call it the spectrum of fans, which is Dave Meltzer to Jim Cornette. That's the one we always kind of go in, is when you're on social media, someone is somewhere along that line. And, you get the middle, you get the balance, and then you get the extremes either end. But I think Japan to Mexico, visualizing it and hearing you speak about it, it just makes perfect sense.
So I think it goes way deeper than, like, I think Dave Meltzer to Jim Cornette is like the middle of the American. Please keep in mind that there is like there's Japanese purist Dave Meltzer and there's Japanese purist Jim Cornette out there as well. And the same thing for Lucha. I'm sure like there's an old angry luchador who complains when people don't jump off the top rope nearly enough in matches. And that, like, There's a lot of
definitely is. Yeah, there's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of different styles, and I think that's kind of what makes wrestling great. You know, if wrestling was one thing, if wrestling was confined to being this, you know, whatever that is, then all of a sudden, the longevity of wrestling disappears. And we've seen already, you know, you've had what we're 2021, a 15-year career. You know, I look back to sort of 2006, we saw you know, looking back at some of the matches you had in sort of Quebec and was it FQW, FCW, and looking at where you've come from there to, you know, your matches against Kevin Steen, Kenny Omega, Bobby Lashley, who you mentioned. You know, each one of these matches has had such a different style, such a different presentation, and you've kind of excelled in crafting the ability to adapt to your opponent. I think people have seen you would say. Is that something you kind of consciously trained to do, or is it just something that's come with experience?
Absolutely. No, it's something that I've had to like really be mindful of, which goes two ways. Like when I wrestled in Mexico, I realized that like you have to understand, again, it's all about the why, right? Being part of a good, like part of being a good wrestler is understanding why you're doing the things. Like why in Mexico people jump off the top rope a lot more than you do in Japan. There's a good reason for that. So when I went to Mexico, knowing that I am never going to be as good at lucha libre than all the other like lifelong luchadors that literally since they were 12 years old have been doing those specific lucha things. No, I have to focus on everything else. And then as well as in Japan, applying my stuff to the Japanese style and make sure that it's familiar enough with the Japanese audiences to play with expectations. But that's absolutely something that I've wanted to do. I like when wrestling in America and achieving what would have been my first goals in wrestling of, you know, getting a big contract and getting paid became unavailable for 5 years. I decided I'm going to make the most out of it. Making the most out of it was not to me like staying in one place and getting better, but it was traveling around and learning from as many different like styles and as many different people as I could. Because, you know, that's the most productive. That's how you get good. I think the best wrestlers in the world, some of the best wrestlers in the world are people that are trained in Mexico and then learn to have good matches in Japan.
I think, you know, when you look at some of the names that come across, and, you know, there's a reason that a lot of talent from Japan has gone on excursions to Mexico. You know, I think, and people that have then from CMML or AAA gone over to Japan, it is a proven recipe for success. So I think that's definitely, you've definitely hit the nail on the head there. I want to talk a little bit about sort of those wow moments, those moments of learning, because that's kind of what makes up wrestling. And, you know, we see now you're passing your wisdom on to people. You know, you're helping craft that next generation, expand people's knowledge, be it talking to fans on Twitch or the, you know, the training and things you are doing. Has there been an opponent or a match or, you know, a period of your career where you reflect on it and you really go, wow, I learned a lot from that?
There have been so many. And I think very often, like for most things, not just pro wrestling, but the learning curve is my Taekwondo coach always said, so the belts in Taekwondo go white, yellow, green, blue, red, and then black. He would always say that green belt was the worst belt because it's when you start thinking you know things. Blue, you then realize you don't. And I think that happens a lot in professional wrestling. A lot of people, like early on in their career, think, okay, I've figured this out. And then wrestle someone and are like, oh boy, I do not have it. And then eventually it happens again. And then you're constantly reproven wrong and put in different scenarios that challenge your beliefs. But it's happened to me, Lord knows how many times. Like the first few matches I had with Kevin Steen, where I Kevin Owens now, where I very much realized, wow, okay, his brain just works differently. He gets it. And then eventually working with Kenny Omega was like, wow, okay, I want to understand what this guy understands. And then getting to Japan and seeing, okay, wow, this is why things, you know, work the way they do. And I assume that if I do at some point start wrestling, like on television, I'll have the same, not that my expectations are that I know anything about wrestling on television or that world, but I assume it'll be the
same experience
if and when that happens.
Before I move on, I'll correct myself because I know the comments will otherwise. It was FLQ in Canada.
FLQ, that is correct.
The company. There we are. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of something you tweeted last night on Dynamite, because we always stalk the people we're interviewing social medias beforehand. It's the way it works nowadays. And you put out this really nice tweet about Ricky Starks and Ethan Page, and how sort of rewarding it was to see people who have grafted get given this sort of television spot to shine. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, sort of how that feels, and if there's anyone from your time, be it Japan, Canada, wherever, where you're kind of looking at them and going, why have they not had that opportunity yet? Like, they are perfect for it.
I know better than to ask myself that question. Like to think about it. It's nice when it does, but I understand that wrestling has a lot of moving parts, and sometimes to a pro wrestling career, there is so much more than just talent that comes into play. And like, there's a lot of good-hearted people that just, for whatever reason, it doesn't work out. And I mean, it's awesome when it does, but I do not beat myself up when it doesn't, for people that I really care and wish it for them, because like, it could be whatever reason, but also maybe they're happy in what they're doing. Like, success can be measured differently for guys like, which I mentioned in the tweet, which were Ethan Page and Ricky Starks, who got, huge moments on last night's Dynamite. As you're watching this, I have no idea when this comes out, but you now know when it was recorded. This is what they wanted. Like, right now, what they're doing, what happened on TV, I believe, from knowing them and talking to them, that is what they wanted. That is the kind of moment they want. And I think that happens, and it's lovely to see, especially in front of audiences that are coming back. But I think there's a lot of different versions of that in wrestling that should all be celebrated. But that's a long answer to your question.
You mentioned sort of different angles and different wants from wrestling, and you mentioned earlier on that your initial goal, or one of the things you first considered as like, this is what I want in wrestling, was that contract, that sort of that signing thing. And I address the elephant in the room. We had heard conversations and reports from Wrestling Observer and things like that you might have been approached by a certain company and the WWE. Is there any truth to that? Is that something that you still consider your goal, or are you still more open to what you want from wrestling now?
I mean, I'm very focused on long-term goals. I'm not signed anywhere right now. If that's the question, but I mean, of course, I am not specifically goal oriented. I will take whatever opportunity comes my way and make the most of it. I have a long-term goal with wrestling, which is to become a millionaire and share my passion and teach a good, objectively fun, replicable version of pro wrestling to as many people as possible. But there's many steps between me and that, and I'll get there however makes the most sense.
I think it's great that you're keeping that sort of end goal in mind, because it is what drives anyone, be it wrestling or somebody who's in high school aiming to become a lawyer, a doctor. Having that thing to help you when those days where you don't want to get out of bed, you're comfy and you need to go work out. Having that end goal in mind is always a great thing to have. I want to talk a little bit about Canadian wrestling, because I think as a wrestling scene, it's one of the most interesting ones at the moment, because Mexico is fairly established and known internationally. Japan and America obviously are. The UK's had the last couple of years. It's in a bit of a shaky place at the moment. But Canadian wrestling is a strange one, where people know a lot of Canadian wrestlers. There's a lot of excellent Canadian talent around, yourself included. We've got Josh Alexander in Impact, Kenny Omega AEW, Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens, a plethora of them in the WWE as well. What is it about Canadian wrestling that you think really contributes to its ability to keep churning out excellent talent? And do you think there's maybe a stage in the next sort of 5-10 years where we could see a product in Canada that is viewed internationally in the same way of wrestling in Japan and Mexico and the US is?
So Canada is a strange place because it's like so close to the US, yet just a little bit too far, right? For American companies to actively recruit Canadians in the same way that they do Americans. The necessity for work visas just doesn't make that possible. Um, there's a lot of bad wrestling in Canada. There's a lot of bad wrestling everywhere. I think so. The perception kind of in Canada is because also it's very close. Um, People get a lot of time to be, you know, not as good as they are, and then finally reach their potential, and then finally be on everyone's radar. And I think that's a big part of it. But I don't think that only applies to Canada. I think that applies to so many other countries. I dedicate one day a week usually to streaming in French, and I have a lot of people that has connected me to the French from France wrestling community. Try to play like as many francophone matches, and I've found a lot of indie wrestlers, and the independent wrestling scene in France is very, very good. There's a lot of very, very good wrestlers, but still, just because of the linguistic barriers, it feels a lot like Quebec, where it's like you're so close yet so far. There's a lot of French talent that would have a perfectly good place on UK independent shows, but they don't get there because they're, just a little bit too far away, right? And then there's so many other countries in the world like that. Southeast Asia has a booming wrestling scene that I'm sure you know very little about because many people don't. But it's absolutely fantastic, and it's amazing. The visa thing is a real shame, and the fact that it's so difficult to cross that border into the US for Canadian wrestlers, and that because of that, I don't think Canadian wrestlers get a fair shake at the biggest opportunities when compared to American wrestlers. What I hope for the future is that the internet will be the great equalizer, and I think a lot of wrestlers have learned this during the pandemic, not being able to wrestle and having to move, from a real live community of interacting with people at shows to moving that online. And now, given that you can put everything you do online and you can be just as much part of the discussion as if you were there in person, I hope that through the internet, Canadian wrestlers and French wrestlers and Southeast Asian wrestlers and Russian wrestlers and from all the wrestlers from the countries that don't have like giant scenes will be able to use the internet in order to sort of level the playing field a little bit. It will never be as easy. It will never be as easy for a wrestler that is born outside of Florida to get a W contract as a wrestler that is born like in Florida, in like where there's so much wrestling, or the like northeastern United States, or where there's a lot of opportunities available. No, you'll have to work harder and create your own opportunities. One of the best things that came out of the pandemic that I hope will stay is studio wrestling as a concept, and the fact that wrestling without a crowd has been normalized, because that makes it so much more accessible for wrestlers in, let's say, Turkey. We're putting on a wrestling show is nearly impossible. Getting enough people to pay tickets to cover the costs and convincing whoever owns a building that it's okay to have a wrestling show, that's a lot less accessible than it is for people to just decide, hey, we're going to put on a camera, we're going to broadcast it on, Twitch or YouTube or Facebook or wherever, and we're going to, hopefully get some eyes on us through that. I hope that keeps happening. I think that's happening in a lot of revolutionary ways around the world. I don't know if you're familiar with ChocoPro.
Yes.
I am. Yes, good. So ChocoPro are in Japan. They're run by Emi Sakura, and they host a lot of people that you've seen on AEW, like Mei Suruga and Sakazaki Yuko is more Tokyo Joshi, but I think she's been there. I don't know. Wrong example. Regardless, bunch of other people. What they do is they simply have wrestling. It's live on YouTube. It's on one big brown mat, hence ChocoPro. And I think what they're doing is absolutely revolutionary. I think it will change wrestling. I think it makes being a pro wrestler and getting better at this art form much more accessible. And I think that's what pro wrestling needs more than anything. So to recap my long answer to your question, I think the focus needs to be on, like, you have to think globally if you're a wrestler from a small place, and you have to compare yourself to the global scale. You have to try to be visible on a global level and use social media to your advantage.
I think it's interesting because I've spoken to a few people recently who, yourself, Effie and Maria Kanellis of Ring of Honor, and a lot of the focus from those guys has been on the power of social media, and they mentioned this as well as yourself, sort of how COVID has normalized sort of the product and the presentation of sort of no fan wrestling. And every time it's come up, I've said the same thing. I completely agree. I think as someone who sort of works on social media, be that, you know, a blessing or a curse, you know, I see a lot of these clips getting shared of wrestlers in the Philippines, wrestlers in Venezuela, and, you know, even within smaller companies in the United States, the reach and the virability of, you know, especially with the rise of TikTok and short form content, like there's a lot of traffic and attention to be driven, and it's great to see
Yes.
Image and Choco Pro. You know, it's great to see that being normalized and becoming sort of more prominent, because it does just remove the barrier of entry for a lot of people. You know, there's a lot of talented performers out there that just aren't lucky enough, like you said, to live in Florida.
So to speak to the popularity of wrestling and of making new fans, I mean, the biggest sport in the world is football, as you call it. So I would say soccer. But like, why? Because if you have a ball and two rocks, anyone can play football. And then if you've played football, it's that much easier to relate to the professionals. And when you watch one of the world's best football players, you're like, oh my God, I've tried this and I cannot do this like that. That is wildly impressive. I think wrestling is the same way.
I remember
the more accessible you make it, the more people can do it, the more of their friends watch it. And then the more you watch people do it, there is very much this attitude in wrestling that like somehow bad wrestling hurts wrestling. And it just doesn't happen. Like, because bad wrestling is entertaining. Even if it's not excellent, it's still a fun show.
Yeah.
And I think people are starting to find that out more and more. You go to a show, it's not that great. You go, okay, that was some cool wrestling. And then someone goes, oh yeah, well, check this out, which is much better than having the perception of wrestling is only Hulk Hogan and Macho Man, and that's it.
Just when you mentioned football, soccer there, it just took me back to my childhood there for a second, because the sport I played as a kid was ice hockey. Edinburgh was lucky enough to have a team here, and my dad was a big fan. He's a Maple Leafs fan. I'm a Senators fan. Well, it caused some issues, but I always remember
some issues right now.
It's fine. We're never getting anywhere near the Stanley Cup anyway. But unfortunately, at this rate, it seems like no Canadian team is. But
I'm not a big hockey fan.
But I always remember the issue being that my friends would come and watch me play and train, but the cost of entry is crazy. And you know, much like anyone who's tried to do wrestling, so is wrestling. You know, especially here in the UK, you need to find a school, you need to get to the school, and schools are expensive. And then having that thing of, well, how do I go from training in a church in Edinburgh to WWE, AEW, whatever your goal is? It's crazy, and it's good to see this sort of new approach being normalized. Got two questions, then we'll wrap up. We always like to end our interviews, or I do at least at Inside the Ropes, with a stupid question that I know you're not going to get asked at any other interview, because wrestling interviews tend to fall into the same. What's your dream match? Who's your dream opponent? What's your coolest move? So we always like to end on a stupid question. So we'll end with that. But before then,
which I'm okay with, by the way. Sorry to cut you off, but this is another thing. Like, I read Twitter a lot, and I see a lot of things, and they bother me. Like, oh, I'm so tired of doing the podcast because they always ask the same questions. But of course they do, because you have a guest. You think, what does your audience want to hear about this guest? And of course, there's not like 1 million different things. No one cares what my favorite flavor of pudding is. Like, there's the important stuff that people want to know, and that's how you'll get the views for your video.
It is a difficult balance. I remember, I won't name because you don't want to cause issue. There was a guy in MLW who had come out and basically said what you said of, I'm tired of sitting down for an interview and someone just asking me the same thing I was asked last time. And as someone who does interviews, I'm sat there going, I get that. And, you know, do the research, try and take a new approach on things. but there are things that fans want to know, and fans of one interviewer, YouTube channel, podcast aren't the same as the other. But it's a difficult balance. I think it's like wrestling. It's like, especially companies that do house shows and tours. You might have the same match 100 times, you just put a different swing on it. But last normal question before we, take this in a strange direction. You mentioned visa issues. Obviously, it's well known at this point. 5 years is over. I just want to ask her, reflecting on the 5 years, or maybe discount the last year, COVID. Do you think that had the visa issues not occurred, had you had the ability to continue working in the US, do you think you would be at the stage you are now? Do you think you might have been further? Is that something you think about, or do you try to take the approach of there's no point sitting here and looking at the ifs, buts, and maybes? This is what's happened, and I'm proud of what I've done. Is it, or is there like that little part of you that's like, if that hadn't happened, I could be here by now?
Of course, the real ultimate answer is I have no idea. I have no clue at all. Could have been a lot worse. I mean, I feel like it's pretty much 50-50. It happened. It's objectively a bad thing, but I think I did pretty all right. If it hadn't had happened, I don't know. I might something else might have happened that's terrible. I can go way back and think of things like, what if I had never started wrestling at all? What if I had done a lot of things different? It's of course I've gone through all the possible scenarios in my head and thought back of all the what ifs, and what if I had done this different? What if this had happened? And the answer is it's also random. I don't know.
Well, I think fans who've had the pleasure of seeing you over the last 5 years will be glad that they've had that sort of honor that opportunity. Like I said, saw you in Brighton. That was maybe something that wouldn't have happened. So I think the fans who've had the ability to see you are glad that it had, although not in a way of, I'm glad he got band entry, but I think they're happy for the memories.
Ultimately, I'm extremely satisfied with my career the way it's been and the way it's going. I'm very happy about it. I'm blessed in so many regards when it comes to pro wrestling and otherwise. And I absolutely cannot complain with everything I've done. I mean, of course, there are frustrations. There always will be. There have been many, many extremely frustrating moments, and there will be more. And I look forward to them. But I'm satisfied with what I've done. Again, the growth has been constant and in the way that I want it to go. So I cannot it's very hard to complain about anything, even the bad stuff.
Well, perfect. So before we go, Mike Bailey, international wrestling sensation, Twitch megastar, Canadian icon. What is your food pet peeve?
My food pet peeve.
Yes. What winds you up about something in food? We've had Dylan Hornswoggle Postel talk about boneless ribs. LG Cleary from OTT talked about sort of wraps that are wrapped in the paper they're cut. Effie talked about cooked clams. It might be something in a fast food restaurant that you don't like, or something that other people do with food that just gets on your nerves stupidly. But what is it?
That's a very, very hard question, because I feel like I have so many of those, but it's never like it's going to be very hard to narrow it down to one. Because I feel like they're never pet peeves, but they're always criticisms. Let me try to sum it up to one in my area of expertise, which is poutine. Which I don't know if you're familiar with poutine, but it is a Québécois dish. And if you hear someone say that it's a Canadian dish, please smack them square across the head, because that is a goddamn lie. It is only 3 ingredients, but it is very, very easy, evidently, to get it wrong by using, there's only 3 ingredients. So if you use one of them wrong, you're off, right? Fries need to be fresh cut French fries from potato, not curly fries, not crinkly, not frozen, not little julienne fries, just Belgian style potatoes, you may know them as, right? Where you take a potato, you cut it, and then you fry it twice. That is the proper fry. And then the gravy, there's a lot more room on that because it's a demi-glace, but like I guess any gravy is a lot looser. It's the powdered stuff, right? I wish it wasn't, but it's usually the powdered stuff, which that's where there's the most wiggle room. But it needs to be sort of just a salty, mildly flavored brown sauce. And then the cheese, it needs to be curd cheese, like the little squeaky curd cheese that you cannot find anywhere else other than Quebec. People say Wisconsin, and I say, it's the next best thing, but it's not the same. If your poutine has grated cheese on it, you are wrong. And then, when it comes to the serving, there are certain things that are of the utmost importance. The poutine, the fries and sauce must be hot, and the cheese must be cold. Purists, because if not, the cheese melts and you don't get the textural contrast, and then what's the point? The purists will have the fries and the sauce and then put the cheese on the side and then pick up a bit of cheese, pick up a bit of fries and eat that. If the cheese gets all melted, no good. As well, the container it is served in. Cardboard, no good. A plate, no good. You got to keep the heat. It needs to be a shallow container for the fries and sauce. Like a hot ceramic bowl is fine, but the ideal is styrofoam or an aluminum plate, an aluminum like takeout container, so that the bottom can be filled with the hot fries covered in sauce, and then the cold cheese can go on top.
I'm not sure if you ever had this, and I'm sure this is gonna irk you. I'm not sure if you ever had this when you were over here in the UK. But in the UK, we do, and it's not the same thing. We do chips and cheesy chips.
Yes.
And that would usually come with gravy. And I'm so glad you mentioned the cardboard container thing, because I am
soggy.
I am a man who, especially during lockdown, has become very fond of delivery food. And the amount of times, I'm like, I want chips and cheese, and it comes and it's in the cardboard container, it's soggy. And so for some reason, I think they think they're being nice. They put cheese at the bottom as well. And then by the time you take it out and by the time it gets here,
the cheese just
it's
stays
just
there. There's no
it basically forms like a block of chips. But no, I think knowing that the rough idea of poutine, I've only had it from sort of imitation restaurants here that do it. But I've always had it where they've given me the cheese melted, and it's never hit the spot. Whereas, the texture you mentioned, I think any Canadians who see this or sorry, Quebec specific will.
Thank you. French
agree.
Canadian is acceptable.
So, Mike Bailey, let's end on that note, because otherwise I'm going to start thinking about cheesy chips and get hungry. And I'm sure you've got lots to get on with. Before we go, we mentioned your Twitch where you do everything. You watch wrestling, you talk about food. Obviously, you're on there with your partner and fellow wrestler, announcer, commentator Veda Scott.
Hell yeah.
Plug everything you need to do. Where can people support you? What's the best way to support your channel and everything? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm at Speedball Bailey on Twitter and Instagram, which is probably the main places where I post my stuff. I have Facebook pages and stuff, but really, who cares? Twitch.tv/Speedball Bailey. I post my schedule on the Twitter and on the Discord. So if you just go on my Twitter, all my Twitch stuff is pretty easy to find. It's twitch.tv/Speedball Bailey. If you give me a follow, that is greatly appreciated. But the main thing you can do if you really want to help me is, if you've never seen any of my matches, go on YouTube, put in Speedball Mike Bailey. There's loads of good ones on there that you can enjoy. And if you like them, please share them. Pro wrestling, everything, all the content I make, as well as the podcast to which you're listening right now, doesn't put out ads on television, doesn't have billboards, probably doesn't pay for commercials, right? No, don't pay for commercial. So the only way any of this grows is by you sharing the stuff and you telling your friends, and all those retweets, those shares, those posting those matches that you like or that interview that you enjoyed. on your Facebook and just say, this is a good interview. It costs you nothing at all, but it helps us out tremendously. So please, thank you in advance for all your shares.
Well, you heard it there, guys. Go support Mike. Check out his stuff. There's, I believe, some of the stuff that I was at in Riptide's on there that's superb. Great promotion as well. Check all that stuff out. Make sure to follow inside_the ropes on Twitter. You can get me at LiamAStewart. I'll be retweeting a bunch of Mike's stuff. So if you forget at Speedball Bailey, you'll be able to see it on mine as well. Thank you very much for listening, guys. We will be back soon with an interview with Rohit Raju from Impact Wrestling. So keep your eyes out for that. Otherwise, have a lovely day and keep safe.